Good afternoon. This is the very first event to be held in this building. I'm Dean Martha Minow. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you all here to Harvard Law School. Last Sunday, Harvard Law School joined with people around the country and around the world in marking the 10th anniversary of 9/11. One of our students, a New Yorker, spoke of the fear, dislocation, and mutual aid he encountered. Another spoke about his decision to join the Army on September 12, 2011, and his recognition, in his words, that he gained more than he gave in the subsequent 6 years he served in Iraq and Afghanistan. The conference today and tomorrow reflects our commitment to examine domestic and international policies, past, present, and future, responding to the terrorist attacks that killed 2,996 people 10 years ago on U.S. soil, and the recognition of the risks produced by those indelible events. There are profound and daily risks to our security, and by our, I mean in the United States and in the world. There are also profound risks of faulty reactions and policies that can make matters worse, jeopardizing not only security, but also our values. Law, Security, and Liberty after 9/11 is the first public project of the brand new Harvard Law School Brookings Project on Law and Security, coordinated by the incomparable Rita E. Hauser Professor of Human Rights and International Humanitarian Law, Gabriella Bloom, and her partner in this project, the brilliant Benjamin Wittes, Senior Fellow in the Governance Studies in Brookings Institution. As for Gabby, I know no one who so well combines tough-mindedness, imagination, big thinking, and nimble practicality, except perhaps Rita Hauser, who with her visionary husband Gus graces us here today. Ben's writings on candor after Guantanamo, justice in the age of terror, and his influential Lawfare blog offer excellent nonpartisan analysis and discussion of tough issues in this challenging time. The partnership between Harvard Law School and Brookings exemplifies the links across theory and practice that are the signature of this school and reflect our commitment to leverage what we can to make a difference in the world. Together, these two have planned a conference that will draw us into the treatment of transnational crime, with pirates even as a course of learning about the treatment of terrorism, domestic counterterrorism and international counterterrorism, relationships between the United States and Islamic societies abroad, as well as U.S. treatment of Muslims domestically, the presidency, accountability mechanisms, checks and balances, civil liberties, and privacy. I found an amazing connection between this activity and a tradition at this school of honoring a man named Francis Biddle, and therefore I decided to call this the Francis Biddle Lectures. It's not exactly your typical lectures. I think it'll be more interactive and more interesting. But let me tell you for a moment about Francis Biddle. A 1911 graduate of Harvard Law School, he began his career as private secretary to Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr. He served as the Attorney General for the United States during World War II. He also served as a U.S. member of the International Military Tribunal in Nuremberg. Along the way, he chaired the National Labor Relations Board. He was a federal judge. He was Solicitor General. He was the director of the Immigration Naturalization Service. He used the Espionage Act during World War II to shut down what he called vermin publications. He opposed the Japanese-American internment during the war, but eventually he supported the policy for political reasons, and then he was haunted by that decision for the rest of his life. As the primary American judge during the Nuremberg trials, he dealt with the legal response to mass violence. His novel, his biography of Justice Holmes, and his 2 volumes of memoirs are very interesting, but most relevant to us are his books about democratic thinking about war and about the United States' role in the post-war era. So I think it's incredibly appropriate that we remember him as we launch this conference and this program. His wife donated the money that supports these lectures, saying that civil liberties and civil rights were a particular concern to my husband and thus particularly appropriate subject matters. We may be talking more about security than civil liberties and civil rights, but it is that tension that I think will be very much at the core of our considerations. When 9/11 occurred, on 9/11, I think I, like many people, struggled with the realization that we knew our lives would change, but we didn't know how. We're honored by the participation of such a distinguished and experienced group of people, scholars, public servants, and advocates who've been in the front lines of changing this world. With deep thanks for your wisdom and efforts, I look forward to the future. I look forward to this day and a half, but the future beyond, as we address law, security, and liberty after 9/11. Thank you for being here.
So thank you all for coming. Thank you, Dean Minow, for welcoming us here into this amazing building, which I have only seen from the outside before. I want to talk very briefly about the partnership that this is the inaugural event of. And then I will turn it over to Gabby, who will talk about the event itself. This is the first of what I hope will be many events and projects of partnership between two very remarkable institutions that bring a very deep and very different expertise in a wide range of, obviously, law, but also relevant policy areas. And in the case of this institution, brings something else that's deep and in the last day that I've been here just been amazing to me, which is the energy and enthusiasm of really amazing students who we hope to involve in very pervasive ways in this project. The conference that we're starting today and that Gabby's going to talk to you about more specifically, I think typifies several things that we hope to make a feature of the larger work of the project. And I'd like to sort of tick through them a little bit. The first is that there's been enough shouting after 9/11 from different ideological perspectives and at each other. And we really wanted to build a project that is non-ideological, very politically independent, and committed to the idea that these ideas are hard, these problems are hard, and that the tent has to be very large, that wisdom isn't going to come from one corner and we're not going to reach it by shouting the other side down, whoever the other side happens to be at any given time. The second is, and this sounds a little peculiar, I know, but the idea of generating work product that is actually useful to people who have to make decisions. This is not to say that a lot of work product isn't useful to people who have to make decisions, but it's a dirty little secret that actually there's a lot of noise relative to signal in the discussions that surround these issues, and we want to produce material and discussion that actually addresses the decision points of real-world decisions. And I think the conference that we've put together was done with a great deal of attention to that. The third thing is, and this is also something that I think both Gabby and I feel very strongly about, is the idea that these are interdisciplinary problems. We tend to think of national security, we think of law, we think of national security law, but the discipline, the problems invoke a whole range of other subjects. They invoke, technological developments. They implicate, history. They implicate social psychology. They implicate all sorts of areas that are not immediately that you don't immediately evoke when you say the words national security law. So we want to think about these issues in as broad a way philosophically and methodologically as we can. And then finally, we want to address issues of security in the broadest sense of the word. You know, the word security often has the word national appended to it in front, as though one can have national security without having a broader security and a narrower security. You know, it's very hard to have national security if you have very, very pervasive crime, for example, at a local level. And so you can't quite divorce these questions from very local questions. Similarly, you can't divorce them from much more global and international questions. And so we wanted to create something that treats the problem as a species of a much broader range of security issues. There are other things that threaten us other than being blown up by terrorists, although that certainly is a big one. I want to talk a little bit about the other projects that we have started here, and then, so we're in the offing stages of several projects. The first one, which we will be, announcing more formally in the near term, is a task force that we're putting together on the implications across, again, a lot of these methodological and disciplinary areas of the future of weaponry. This involves, people think when they hear about the future of weaponry, they think you're talking about drones, but it's not necessarily limited to drones. There's also, there are all sorts of issues of miniaturization in robotics. There are all sorts of issues of, in nanotechnologies. Weaponry is changing in incredible ways at a pace that is very, very dizzying to imagine, to the point that it's almost hard to know today what is a weapon and what isn't. So we're going to put together a group to look very seriously at that from a lot of different perspectives. Secondly, and this again goes back to the point that I made earlier about the student body here. I just came from a meeting with my co-author on this paper, Bobby Chesney, and a remarkable group of students here who are, this was a paper that Bobby and I prepared with a former Harvard student on the landscape of detention law that's emerging from the Guantanamo habeas cases. And these are, this environment is changing so fast that as new cases come out, we've been trying to integrate them into the paper and keep the paper reasonably up to date. And so in a sort of great example of the kind of collaboration that we're trying to put together between institutions, a group of students here has taken over a chunk of maintaining and updating and keeping that paper current. And so what we're trying over time to build a sort of almost like a crowdsourced treatise that will be as that will change as the very fast-moving pace of the law changes. And then finally, the other day I was trying to, he's not here right now, I don't think, but I was trying to persuade Jack Goldsmith to publish a series of interviews that he did in connection with his book and to figure out a way to write them up and put them out there. And I mentioned this to David Barron, who I was talking to yesterday, and he said, well, that sounds like a great oral history project, that we should do a larger oral history of post 9/11 and pre 9/11 national security law. And I think that this idea, which was just sort of very casually thrown out there, has moved me. I think it's just a terrific idea. And so I think Gabby and I are very excited about it. We're looking forward to sort of exploring ways to do that. So I will turn it over to Gabby. I just want to say, if I stopped now and tried to thank everybody who was essential in making this partnership happen, it would, I'm afraid it would bore you all immensely. But I would like to mention, first of all, the incredible support that Dean Minow has shown for this project, which has been completely unstinting. And I would like, as well, there are a lot of people at both institutions, when you try to take two institutions that have very different organizational cultures and very different ways of talking about what they do, and they actually do very different things, and you try to make a joint project, there's a million things that you didn't anticipate that come up that you kind of scratch your head and say, gee, I don't really know, how do you do that? And there are a lot of people who've spent a lot of time working through a lot of those issues at both institutions, and you know, I will not list them all, but all of you have my very deep appreciation. And finally, my just warm thanks and regards to Gabby, who has been just such a pleasure to work with, and who I really look forward to doing many more of these projects with. And thank you all for coming, and welcome. Gabby.
Good afternoon. I think you've gathered that I'm Gabby Bloom. Thank you all for being here. The attacks of 9/11, beyond the immediate devastation they wrought, also brought down traditional categories around which we had organized much of our ethical, legal, and political institutions and discourse. Over the ensuing decade, a war was born for which no end is in sight, which was and still is neither peace nor traditional warfare. Nor is there one type of warfare. There are counterinsurgencies and counterterrorism operations, humanitarian interventions, stability operations, policing, and all of them often take place at the same time. Our enemies are no longer uniformed soldiers, nor are they, for the most part, common criminals. We often go after known individuals who have a name and a face, but these individuals pose a threat which is far greater than the one posed by ordinary crime. Calibrated to the new type of threat, neither the term war nor the term law enforcement give us an accurate label for what we do. War no longer corresponds to national boundaries. It originates in an enemy which is transnational, dispersed, and disaggregated. Sometimes it even includes our own citizens. Al-Qaeda is neither a sole enemy nor a coherent one. In the same vein, nationality is no longer synonymous with either enmity or allegiance. Allegiance no longer begins or stops at the national border. Civilians and combatants are seldom distinct groups and can never be simply assumed by some generic reference. Nor is the war fought on purely military grounds. It includes what we often refer to as the war over hearts and minds, which includes political, economic, civic, cultural dimensions, none of which the traditional war, just war paradigm is really fit to cover. Natural disasters and security threats feed one another. Fragile states are more susceptible to natural disasters, and when disaster strikes, they become even more easily exploited by rogue elements, as all too well demonstrated by Somalia. The outcome, as Ben said, is that national security can no longer be simply national. It must take into account the security of others, especially the human security of others, including others beyond our borders. It is within this complex, fluid, and still mostly novel reality that those in charge of our national security must operate. We rely on them to devise a sound strategy. And what a sound strategy is a strategy that is both effective, but also loyal to our principles and values of how we define ourselves and how we distinguish ourselves from our enemies. And this is no simple task. It is too often that these debates get reduced to simplistic sound bites, slogans, which refute either the idea that force or coercion can ever be effective, or which exaggerate the threat beyond reason to justify abandonment of all legal or moral principles. Tough choices arise precisely because neither extreme is right, because generally some degree of coercion is necessary, and because the threat is, while not existential in the Cold War sense of the word, is nonetheless real and varied. At the same time, it can never be the case that we will do everything to meet that threat, at least not before we reach the apocalypse. So we will have to do something. How little then is too much? These are the main challenges that the United States will face going forward, and here are a few questions for us to consider over the next couple of days. What is the right mix of coercion and construction, of disabling the enemy while changing the conditions that allow for it to grow and operate? How do we meet a complex threat that involves states, non-state actors of various forms, transnational crime, and fragile communities all over the globe? Who in the government should be responsible for making these choices and policies? Is it the executive? Is it Congress? What is the right allocation of power and authority between them? How can America, as the world's leading superpower, lead the world and help shape norms that govern it, while still remaining a member and, frankly, reliant upon an international community, parts of which may not share the same views with us of either the threat or the response? Technology, again, Ben talked about technology, will play a huge and increasing part of both what the threat looks like and what are possible reactions to it. But in developing technologies, one would have to consider the effects of having this technology around. Once it's there, it doesn't belong only to one side. What can it do in our hands? What can it do in the hands of our enemies? What can it do within our society at large? In thinking about law, what types of adaptations are still necessary to existing regimes? And can adaptations be made in a way that would allow calibrating them to the changing nature of the threat, if and when necessary? And still yet, the hardest question, I believe, is a social one. Terrorism is here to stay. No one has a monopoly over its employment, as we've seen in the recent massacre in Norway. We must seek a social consensus around the question what degree of threat we are willing to accept, what degree of risk we can live with. In the world of crime and law enforcement, we made that social decision. We decided that we'd rather let 10 guilty people walk free than falsely incarcerate one innocent person. From this fundamentally ethical choice spring our legal and institutional structures. We have not made a similar choice or a similar decision when it comes to terrorism. There is always bound to be an overreaction to the threat and an overcorrection of the response. It's the nature of dealing with new types of threats. The question now remains, as it was before 9/11, around what principles and norms we organize ourselves to make sure that neither the reaction nor the correction is too extreme. There are many, many people who are responsible for this event coming together. It was Dean Minnow's vision and initiative to commemorate 9/11 with an academic tribute, an effort to think deeply together with our students about what we learned over the past decade and about what is still in store for us. Ben Wittes of Brookings was my partner in crime in fulfilling this vision and developing the themes for the conference and choosing the participants. And we're also, both of us, very grateful to Brookings President Stroud Talbot for helping make this happen. My wonderful colleagues David Barron, Jack Goldsmith, Philip Hyman, Julie Kayam, and Dan Meltzer employed their great charm in reaching out to the various participants and enticing them to come join us. Fran McCrossan, our administrative dean, provided the logistical and financial support. Our communication, media services, and events departments helped produce and disseminate the program notes and website and made sure that the new building is ready to accommodate us. Thank you all. Brian Itami, Brian, and the whole gang at the National Security Journal and Harvard National Security and Law Association, including David Palco, Mary Osberg, Matt Trachok, they're all here. We're equal participants in putting this conference together. Many of you received Brian's late night emails. Brian, thank you. Thank you all, really, for all your help on this. My assistant, Brad Connor, who is invaluable on all days, has brought infinite dedication and perseverance to working with me on this, together with Daryl Moranica and others around HLS. Brad, thank you for not shooting me. I really appreciate it. All of us strive to set the stage for this conference's success, and now you, the participants and the audience, are the actors. Before I invite Bobby Chesney to lead us with the first panel, let me offer some general logistical remarks. We're not going to spend any time on introductions. You should have the program notes, and it includes elaborate bios on all the participants. We will ask each panelist to speak for about 10 minutes. They will be strictly enforced by the moderators. And keeping in mind the theme for the conference, which is really thinking more about the future than the past. Moderators will then pose a question or two to the panelists. They will respond, and we'll then open it up for Q&A. And just one thing to remember, all the proceedings of this symposium are recorded both in audio and video. And without further ado, I invite Bobby Chesney in the first panel. Thank you. Okay.
Story of my life.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I want to begin by thanking Dean Minow for everything she's done to support this partnership and all that it's going to be doing going forward. And I also want to thank, of course, Gabby and Ben, both for including me and for all the work that they've done putting it all together. They're both incredible institution builders, and we're all going to reap the benefits of that. This is the panel, What Can and Cannot Be Learned from the War on Terrorism for Other Threats, such as pirates, transnational crime, or drug cartels. With that framing in mind, let me begin by noting that as hard as it is to believe in the year 2011, there was, in fact, a time when terrorism did not dominate the discourse in policy debate relating to national security, policy, and law. For example, if we consider the structure of the National Security Council staff as it was in the early 1990s, up until around 1995, we find that terrorism was just one of several emerging unconventional security issues that were all gathered under the purview of a relatively small directorate that was known by the, at least formally known, by the innocuous name International Programs. It was better known to those in the know as drugs and thugs. And that pretty much said it all. In those years, a now familiar but then still evolving set of economic, technological, social, and political developments were collectively chipping away steadily at the primacy of the nation state in national affairs, in international affairs, and in geopolitics. And there was a dark side to this process. Drugs and thugs was an early institutional response to growing recognition to the existence of this dark side. Put simply, drugs and thugs encompass the amorphous but increasingly important world of non-state actors that were malicious in nature, at least from the perspective of the existing stakeholders in the transnational system. And this included, most notably, international narcotics traffickers, more conventional forms of boundary-crossing criminal organizations, and of course also a constellation of terrorist organizations. These were all, among other things, criminal phenomena, or at least that was the lens through which they were perceived. But even then, simply by virtue of the fact that there was a directorate of NSC staff paying attention to programs relating to them, we see that they weren't simply even then perceived as mere criminal phenomena. Instead, it was recognized that they posed some sort of threat to U.S. national defense or foreign policy, or both. Of course, in short order, terrorism left its brethren in drugs and thugs behind. It leapt ahead out of its cohort in terms of its prominence as a perceived national security threat, and an actual national security threat. It became a defense priority of the first order, among many other things. But the fact remains that there's always been and continues to be an essential kinship between the threat posed by terrorism and the threats associated with these other related phenomena. And now that we're moving into our second post-9/11 decade, we find that drugs and thugs, or perhaps these days, especially having seen Contagion the other day, we should say drugs, thugs, and bugs. They're making their own bid for enhanced attention as premier or at least higher order national security threats, catching up with terrorism to some degree. I find that a very disturbing prospect, but one we have to own up to. I can at least offer you the consolation that we have a terrific panel here to talk about these issues. We're going to begin with Assistant Attorney General Lisa Monaco, head of the National Security Division. She'll be followed by Professor Eugene Kontorovich of Northwestern University School of Law, who is, among many other things, a leading authority on modern piracy law. They'll be followed by Juliette Kayyem, Kennedy School's Belfer Center, among many other things. And I think here, most pertinently, formerly the Assistant Secretary for Intergovernmental Affairs at DHS, which essentially put her both figuratively and sometimes literally at the center of the intergovernmental response for both man-made and natural disasters. And finally, Juan Zarate, formerly Deputy Assistant to the President and Deputy National Security Advisor for Combating Terrorism from 2005 to 2009, which is impressive, but I think he's more famous for the fact that he and I were classmates here long ago.
That's right, Bobby.
Of course, we didn't have this building, did we?
We did not.
So without further ado, I will turn it over to Lisa.
Thanks very much, Bobby. Well, thank you, and I want to congratulate Ben and Gabby and everyone else for putting this program together and on the inauguration of this building and this program. I think it's a great idea, particularly as we mark 10 years since 9/11. And it's great to be here with so many former colleagues. As I look around the room, lots of familiar faces, and it's really nice to be here. I think this is particularly apt subject matter and time to be looking to the future as the program instructs us. We have learned a lot in the 10 years since 9/11, not the least of which is that the terror threat is constantly evolving. So I thought what I might do is provide a little bit of an overview of the threat that we face, both in the national security realm and the terror realm, which is what I know best and what I am most particularly concerned with day to day, but also the other threats that we look to both currently and in the future, and then talk a little bit about the common themes and approaches that we in the government, particularly at the Justice Department, where I work, the common themes and approaches that we have, I think, learned to apply based on what we've seen in the 10 years since 9/11. So the threat landscape, a good time to assess it as we come off commemorating the 10 years since the tragic and dreadful attacks of September 11th. As you all know, and as has been much reported, we spent a good deal of time and continue to address a credible, specific but uncorroborated threat associated with the recent commemoration of 9/11. And I think the government's response to that is a really good example of how far we've come, but also the challenges that we still face. I think we are much, much better at gathering, synthesizing, reporting on, and sharing information than we were at 9/11 and the days after. But sometimes we are unable to ultimately resolve or to individually resolve threats such as the ones that were discussed just days ago. And I think that is a perfect example of the fact that we need to continue to be vigilant and resilient and constantly on our guard for the threat that evolves. So today we continue to face a threat from al-Qaeda, senior leadership and core al-Qaeda, even with the demise of bin Laden. We obviously continue to be very focused on that, but we also face a increasingly decentralized threat, a threat from affiliates such as al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula and groups like al-Shabaab. But I think even more concerning sometimes is, as we see the threat as it evolves, is the threat of the entrepreneurial actor, the lone actor, and those who are inspired by but not necessarily linked to core al-Qaeda or its affiliates. And that is something that we are continually focused on and need to be ever vigilant about. I think even with the demise of Osama bin Laden, who, as we know, was very focused on the spectacular and complex attack. With his demise, and perhaps the demise of discipline that his vision imposed, we must be concerned about the entrepreneurial actor or follower who will act individually and not as part of a complex attack. I think the other thing that we see in the threat landscape is, to coin a phrase that has been much used, the world is increasingly flat. We see a threat from the impact of technology and the increasingly globalized nature of the world in which threat actors, be they terrorists, espionage actors, international organized criminal operations, are all taking advantage of that increasingly globalized and flattened world. So we have a daunting threat picture that we face, but one that we have learned a great deal about. As I said, the impact of technology, but also the convergence of the terror threat with other criminal actors is one that is I think, a real concern to those of us in both the national security community, but also the security community writ large, as Ben would have us describe it. That poses a danger, the convergence of terrorist actors along with criminal actors and organized criminal actors, not only because of the facilitation that the convergence of these groups and these threats can provide to each other, but the flip side, I think, sometimes for those of us in the national security community is it can present an opportunity for disruption as terrorist actors and others use finance networks or communication networks or human smuggling networks, as we saw earlier this week in a recent case in the District of Columbia, as those same tools or tools of the trade are used, they can be exploited by those of us seeking to disrupt both sets of activity. So what have we learned? What have we learned since 9/11 and the 10 years since? I think we've learned that we can't stand still, that the threat is resilient, as I said, and adaptive, and so we must be as well. We must be intel-driven and threat-driven. We must be led by the intelligence and what it tells us. And we must be focused and prioritize the threats that present themselves. We have to use intelligence to develop the threat picture and then prioritize the threats that we face and our resources against them. And I think that's increasingly what you're seeing, certainly in the national security community, but that lesson has been learned across the government, whether we're applying it to threats as diverse as international organized crime or white-collar fraud rings. You see a government that is, and both law enforcement and intelligence, that is looking at increasingly the threat as an intelligence picture to be filled out, not just individual cases to be made. I think we've also learned that we can and should adapt new tools, I should say adapt old tools to the fight, even as we're building and developing new tools. Whether it's the use of undercover operations in terrorist and espionage cases, or using familiar but very important tools like sanction regimes against international organized criminal actors. And finally, I think we've learned that we need to apply all tools to the threats that we face. We have to be relentlessly practical in how we approach the fight, certainly the terror fight, and I think the same holds true across the other threats that we'll discuss today. There is no one-size-fits-all model. We need to use the best tool that applies, it being very results-oriented and focused on what's the best tool to disrupt a particular threat, a particular threat actor. So what are those things? What are the things that we're looking at as we look to the future, as we take stock as to what we've learned? Certainly, the cyber threat in all its forms has to be front of mind and is front of mind, certainly for folks in my business, but across the disciplines that are present in the security community, whether it's state actors, non-state actors, those bent on using cyber tools for criminal gain or espionage in all its forms, whether it's stealing R&D from government contractors or stealing intellectual property. I think the transnational criminal groups who also employ cyber tools, quite obviously, and sometimes will approach the cyber tools as a target. Drug cartels, international organized criminal groups. These are the threats of the future, threats of current times, quite obviously, too, but these are the ones that we're looking to the future to apply the tools that we've learned in the counterterrorism realm. And then, of course, piracy, which I know Eugene will talk about, which is certainly a phenomenon that applies, I was going to say cross-jurisdictionally, if not non-jurisdictionally. And it's a phenomenon that I think is facing and somewhat confounding the international community as to how to address both the commerce that it interrupts and, unfortunately, as we saw with the Quest, the attacks on the Quest, actually resulting in horrible deaths as well. I just say a little bit more about the convergence of terrorist threats with other criminal actors. I think what we've seen interesting examples of criminal networks being used to facilitate, whether it's funding through Hawala networks or human smuggling. Those who are willing to use human smuggling networks, regardless of what they're ferrying and to whom they're assisting, as we saw recently in a case aiding the Pakistani Taliban. I think I'll close with some comments on the common themes and approaches that we are seeing and how we approach both the counterterrorism fight, but also other threats. The first one is fusing intelligence across the government. I think the imperative of connecting the dots, the well-worn phrase of connecting the dots, that imperative, I think, has exploded across the government. You are seeing intelligence fusion centers and the desire to share intelligence as applied to all sorts of threats, whether it's the International Organized Crime Center, which fuses intelligence across the government in order to assist law enforcement in prioritizing and targeting international organized crime, to the task force model, which is obviously very familiar in its approach to gangs and complex crimes amongst federal, state, and local law enforcement. But the Joint Terrorism Task Force model has now been applied to white-collar crimes. The Financial Fraud Enforcement Task Force that has done work in the last couple of years, which not only includes law enforcement, but housing and urban development representation and IGs from across the community. So you're seeing much wider representation and a desire to use intelligence to focus on what the threat is as opposed to individual cases. So fusing intelligence obviously is a huge lesson learned and is applied to all sorts of threats that we face. But I also think the international cooperation and the need for international cooperation, that is something that is a lesson that has been learned in the counterterrorism realm that has been applied now across other threats that we face. It is no longer the case that we can solve terrorist plots by the use of mutual legal assistance treaties, much as that regime has helped us in the past. What's important now is bilateral relationships, very quick, speedy, and real-time exchange of information. You see it in things like the 2006 planes plot, with the plot to send, to explode liquid explosives on planes crossing from London's Heathrow Airport to this country. It was only through the real-time, rapid sharing of information between our partners in the UK and their counterparts here in this country that we were able to discern whether or not there were any linkages to that plot to anybody here. We saw it again in the foiling the printer cartridge plot of last year. Real-time exchanges of information between law enforcement to law enforcement relationships as well as intelligence services is the name of the game in the counterterrorism realm, and we're seeing it. That is also the case in foiling cyber hacking rings and international organized crime rings, intellectual property rings. We are reaping the benefits of those international cooperative relationships that have been built up by necessity in the counterterrorism realm and applying that lesson to other threats. So finally, the other thing I wanted to mention is that we are applying these lessons to ourselves, certainly in the Justice Department. We are not standing still. There have been tremendous changes in the department since 9/11. The division that I have the privilege of leading is a direct result of the changes since 9/11 and the decision to fuse intelligence lawyers with criminal prosecutors and agents and putting all heads against a problem, whether it be an espionage actor or a terrorist network. The reduction of legal walls has resulted in the reduction of structural walls as well, and you have intelligence lawyers sitting together with prosecutors and agents focusing on the terror threat and the espionage threat, and that has been, I think, a tremendous leap forward in our approach as certainly to national security threats. And we are also, as a government, incredibly, in the Justice Department, incredibly intelligence-driven. Every morning, I sit in a threat briefing with the Attorney General and the Director of the FBI to discuss the latest intelligence. And that is something that has happened every day since 9/11 for 10 years. And now those discussions include discussions about criminal threats, cyber threats, white-collar crime threats, and that is something that never would have happened, I think, before 9/11. So as we go forward and we look to the future, what I think you will see, both from folks who talk on this panel as well as the others you'll see for the rest of today and tomorrow, is a discussion of the different tools. And from my perspective, the fact that we need to apply a number of different tools and not be rigid in our approach as we, I think, evolve as fast, hopefully, as the threat actors that we face.
Okay, thank you very much to Gabby and Ben for having me here, and by reference to everyone they mentioned for organizing this. I was walking across to find this building, and I asked a student where it was, and they said, "Huh, never heard of it." So I think Dean Minnow, we're going to put this on the map. In terms of what we can and cannot learn, in terms of pirates and terrorists, we'll start by saying a few words about what we can't learn, but that's not very exciting, so we'll move off of that. Because of some similarities which we'll mention, even before Somali pirates put piracy back on the map, it seemed innumerable commentators and even some congressmen wanted to draw analogies and similarities in the treatment of piracy, and one congressman famously suggested letters of marque and reprisal against terrorists. So there's a lot of differences which should be pointed out at the beginning. Pirates are not state-sponsored, and they're generally not state-harbored. They have no ideology. they're not in it for anything but money, and they attack everyone. Hostis humani generis being the old international law term, which makes them sound scarier at first, but really when you think about it, it should make them easier to deal with. Because since they attack everyone from Yemen to India to the United States, they have no friends, they have no secret sympathizers, they have no soft sympathizers, they have no useful idiots. They're in it for themselves, and they're in it by themselves, which takes lots of the politics off the table. They have business goals, which suggest possibilities for potential engagement. If one is interested in engaging with America's enemies, it would seem that non-ideological enemies would be the kind that would be easier to engage with, and we could talk about that at the end. The bottom line is pirates should actually be considerably easier to deal with than terrorists. So that's not a good thing, because as I'll mention in a minute, we're not really dealing with pirates well at all as an international community. And terrorists, if anything, are going to be harder. They have goals, they believe in things, they're trying to do things other than line their own pocketbooks, and so it should not be surprising that some people will be sympathetic to them. So the overall similarity between pirates and terrorists, and it is noteworthy, is that pirates, like terrorists, are small groups, well-organized, violent groups that function in the gray zone, the interstices between crime and war. They're maybe not combatants, but they're not really criminals in the classic sense that one would think about it, or at least that could be dealt with through the classic tools of a district attorney. They can cause significant international disruption, and they exist in this gray zone, which creates a problem for law, because they will want to manipulate things so as to get the benefits of both statuses in the gray zone. So whether one can learn lessons from piracy about terrorism or terrorism about piracy, I think they're mutually reinforcing lessons. That is to say, if we see certain phenomena are going to be true of the response to pirates and terrorists, we'll think that maybe these are some real phenomena and not accidents. So a brief update on the piracy situation. It's always been around. It never went away, but was usually at a pretty low level. In 2008, due to a phenomenally innovative business model, Somali piracy surged and the level of attacks doubled, which was followed by extraordinary commitments from around the world to deal with it. There were 4 Security Council resolutions under Article 7 in 1 year alone, and they said we're going to put a stop to this. And the following year, the number of attacks doubled again. And they've basically leveled off, but ransoms continue to go up. Higher value targets continue to be attacked. And it's no longer proper to speak of it in terms of Somali piracy, because even though most of the perpetrators are Somalis, with some Yemenis mixed in, they're halfway to India, if not further by now, and casting increasingly broad net and an increasingly impressive array of targets. And if you're looking at it from a business point of view, you'll evaluate their success not by the number of attempts or by the ratio of successes to attempts, which has actually gone down. And so governments want to tell you things are working out because the success rate has gone down, but the ransom payments have gone up, which suggests that they are unhampered and are not going to go out of business anytime soon. So what are some quick lessons that we can draw? Both in the context of terrorism and in the context of piracy, these phenomena arose in the shadows of what I would call legacy global constitutional instruments. Geneva Conventions in the case of terrorism, and the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. These are very old treaties, old for post-war times. They're post-war treaties which are broad in scope, have lots of signatories, and are often spoke of as global constitutional documents, which is often said to be a good thing, except that global constitutional documents are notoriously hard to change. Now, nobody anticipated pirates when they wrote the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. That is to say, there's something like a dozen articles dedicated to pirates, but when you look at the proceedings of the International Law Commission from the 50s, they specifically said, you know, we're writing these just because it's part of the law of the sea traditionally, but it's not really a thing anymore. It's past. So they just thought they would codify it because that's a nice thing to do and it's of some academic interest. And this is explicitly what they said. So needless to say, the instrument that they have left us, which may be a really great instrument in many other ways, creates serious problems when you get to the question of pirates. A couple of those problems. First of all, they're unlike traditional international law, where they could be treated as combatants. Pirates are purely civilians now. All the normal civilian protections apply, which is going to pose a problem since the first responders are generally going to be military forces. Another problem, and we could learn, I think, from the response, is Article 105 of the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea. To get into the weeds a little, if you read it literally, it seems to prevent the transfer of captured pirates to third countries and require that any trial will be by the capturing country. This is a nuisance for the patrolling countries who do not want to try these pirates for reasons we'll get into and want to outsource them to the cheapest justice provider, Kenya or the Seychelles. But Article 105 specifically talks about trials in the courts of the country. So I pointed this out a while ago, and people told me this can't be right. All the countries are outsourcing, so you're wrong. But Article 105 says what it does say. However, the response of the nations, confronted with an inconvenient Article 105, was to completely ignore it, count on the bad defense counsel of the pirates and the leniency of the Kenyan and Seychelles courts in these matters. And they ignored it. And now a contrary state practice has emerged, which of course effectively modifies Article 105 and modifies it in a way to make it useful to the actual piracy threat today. Now, of course, so we could have said, we have this global constitutional document, UNCLOS, it's very special. We need to stick to it in a fundamentalist and expansionist way. That, of course, would only lead in the long run to greater frustration with UNCLOS. And, of course, the same comments could be obviously made about the Geneva Convention. Second point, war is easy, law is hard. So the navies of the world are having an extraordinary success in interdicting pirate attacks, capturing pirates, and the vast majority, many estimates put it at above 90%, of pirates that are captured by the very expensive naval vessels that are looking for them are put back in the water and said, have a good day. If their vessel is defective, which it often is, they're given a little tow back to land as part of duties to distressed mariners. So the reason is nobody wants to prosecute them. And the reason nobody wants to prosecute them is primarily there's some problems prosecuting them. And there's also a big problem that maybe you'll get lucky and convict them, in which case you have a permanent pirate population that you're buying into. So the problems with prosecution, if you tick them off, they sound so much like things we've heard in the context of enemy combatants in Guantanamo. Problems of evidence preservation, problems of witnesses who may not be the most reliable people who may be on the other side of the earth. They're generally apprehended by military forces not necessarily well trained in evidence preservation and have other things on their mind. They have an extraordinary, and also the pirates, like people who may be captured in Afghanistan, for example, none of them have a little piracy ID badge like this, and they all say that they're fishermen or on their way from somewhere to another, and much like Guantanamo detainees who had claimed they were innocent passerbys, aid workers, tourists, or otherwise just someone who happened to be in the zone with a Kalashnikov, and again, to be in the Gulf of Aden with a Kalashnikov is not exceptional and not particularly probative. So it's a hard time identifying people, and it can make proof expensive. Now, then there's the question what to do with them. And there's a huge NIMBY problem with this. Everyone wants pirates to be prosecuted, and there have been just innumerable international meetings calling for pirates to be prosecuted, but the implicit assumption is by someone else. Because there's a lot of them. There's a potentially bottomless pool. Someone mentioned to me that there's 10,000 unaffiliated gunmen on the spot market in Mogadishu. So there's only a few thousand people involved in piracy, but presumably recruiting would not be hard. And how many of these people are you going to have? They're young. They can be in your jails forever. It's expensive. It's problematic. You have to give them translators. So nobody wants these people. Now, even if you think, so again, these are very much the same kind of problems we see in Guantanamo, but what's good about analyzing it from the piracy context is it's depoliticized. No one cares about the pirates or the war about pirates. There's no political element. Everyone just agrees it's just too hard to do. Now, even if you think, by the way, the Guantanamo cases could be done in civilian courts, the pirates present another problem. There's thousands more of them. And this, I think, highlights an issue involving the trial of terrorists in civilian courts, which has not perhaps been as explicit, that we're dealing with this in a particular context that we have. Namely, there's some people in Guantanamo who need to be dealt with. There aren't actually that many people. And one question that needs to be borne in mind is, are the rules that are developed for dealing with, say, people in Guantanamo, are they scalable to a population that would be 10 times larger, for example? Are the proceedings and rights that we want to give, are they scalable? Now, international law has been a complete failure for Somali pirates. Universal jurisdiction has been completely unraveled. We were set back 400 years. in the fight against pirates because of the NIMBY problem, so that while universal jurisdiction exists and we have this beautiful international legal framework, no one is interested in utilizing it because it would be too costly. And there are some other costs which I think we've only begun to feel, which is the possibility of retaliation by pirates. So piracy is an international crime, and it was an international crime long before war crimes and genocide. And if nations are not using international law against pirates, you would expect people like Gaddafi not to get particularly flustered when indicted by the ICC. And pirates really show the difference between these kind of between this and other international crimes. We're trying to prosecute the pirates in real time. That is to say, while they are still out there and have force. So the possibility of retaliation is real. Seychelles captured some pirates. They had to trade them back for some captured Seychelles fishermen held by the pirates. Some British tourists were just abducted by Somalis from Kenya. And this may be part of the same phenomenon. So dealing with international criminals, we've generally dealt with this in Nuremberg-type war crime setting after we have prevailed. The question for international law is, can international criminals be dealt with in real time? One final note. The topic here is what we can learn from piracy and terrorism. I would suggest, maybe this is true of pirates, I don't know. I'm of terrorists, I don't know. But pirates, they can also learn themselves from what we learn. And they can learn from terrorism also. So I wrote about this in an article, A Guantanamo on the Sea, the difficulty of prosecuting pirates and terrorists. And I'll just close with the two little quotes, the epigrams at the beginning, which really sum it all up. The German defense minister, Hamburg was a likely location for the trial of pirates because of the law of the sea court. He said, nobody wants Guantanamo on the sea. And the Kenyan justice minister recently echoed this. And then there was a quote from a great article by Jeffrey Gettleman, who's been extraordinary in his coverage of the Horn of Africa, a quote from a Somali pirate who says, "They can't stop us. We know international law."
Thank you, Eugene.
Thank you, Bobby and Ben, Gabby, Martha, for such a spectacular grouping of people, and also for the launching of this initiative. I want to apologize for my phone. Sometimes smartphones we forget are actually phones and not just watches, which was its purpose. So now I don't know the time, so I want you to tap me when I'm getting close. So one of the prerogatives of being on a panel, people well ingrained on such important transnational threat issues like crime and piracy and drug cartels, is that I can interpret the panel name as it suits me. Mostly because my experience the last several years has been less on the law, though relevant as always, but on homeland security and defense. In some ways, that has a lot to do with the law, of course, and what is interesting as a nation is how we defend ourselves and even prevent harm from all sorts of threats consistent with our democratic values. And that's also true of homeland security. So what can and cannot be learned from the war on terror, which is in quotes, and I'll keep the quotes, for other threats. The 10 years since September 11th have taught us much, but they are not consistent years. We have learned, sometimes unlearned, even relearned lessons, and changed along the way. There are pivot points along the way. I think the war in Iraq, Abu Ghraib, certainly a new president. But one that shouldn't be neglected, or one pivot point, is Hurricane Katrina. It taught us much, and as we look to the future, which we've been urged to do, but I think it mostly taught us that a nation that may be too focused on a war on terrorism is surely going to have difficulties defending against other threats. So I want to flip the question in the panel and answer it from another viewpoint. What can the lessons learned from an effort to protect ourselves from non-criminal threats help us in the war on terror? So I've had my share of non-criminal threats. I've also had my share of terrorist threats at the Department of Homeland Security, but there are a couple from some incidences that I was intimately involved with which may be helpful as we look to the future. So the first is, may be helpful, may provide lessons, they may be challenges that are consistent with the war on terror, but I just thought I would lay them out. So the first is that the supply chain of trouble is obviously agnostic to borders, and that's true for criminals and pirates. It's also true of hurricanes, oil spills, earthquakes, and pandemic flu. So you said bugs, so for the oil spill, I'm going to add plugs, and now we've got our 4. But one of the things to remember about that, and certainly those of us who've served in government, is the focus on the immediate threat is very different than the focus on the long-term threat. And a war on terror, or calling it a war on terror, is sometimes reflective of that. There was an immediate threat, which is Al-Qaeda and its affiliates. It actually remains an immediate threat. But this notion of a war on terror, a method, began to infiltrate the way we think about it and the way our government structures were formed around it, in particular, the Department of Homeland Security. So I think, though, in having to deal with crisis response, one of the things that we always have to focus on is the immediate threat and the protection of life. And there may be bigger existential, legal, or whatever else questions out there. But sometimes the immediate harm can be dealt with, and you don't have to have an existential crisis about it. I don't mean that's true for 9/11, but certainly other nations approach the terrorist threats that they have in ways that are not as transformative, I would say, as September 11th was for us. Or to quote Lisa, that your relentlessly practical line is brilliant. So, for example, in the Haiti earthquake, which you would think has nothing to do with us except for our humanitarian desire to help the Haitians, I'll tell you an awful truth, that was true. It is also true that those of us at the department, and certainly one of our component agencies, the Coast Guard, were equally terrified of mass migration. Because if you didn't stabilize Haiti, the reason why people leave their nations is that they have no hope for the future. And ironically, in the literature of mass migrations, people tend not to leave their countries after natural disasters like an earthquake, because they still love their countries, but mass migrations often occur because of political unrest. So one of the reasons why we had this immediate focus on Haiti, an important humanitarian, but also a national security focus, was because of the immediate threat that a bunch that hundreds of thousands of Haitians would get into boats would be harmful to them, certainly harmful to us. And as is public knowledge and publicly disclosed, our Haitian plan is not like our Cuba plan, that we don't, Haitians who come here do not get immediate sanctuary. So, so one thing is sort of one lesson that those of us who do a lot of crisis is sort of this focus on the immediate threat. And if you can maybe contain that threat, the bigger issues and what still is occurring in Haiti are out there, but one that becomes more manageable when the immediate threat is gone, which I think we were able, not just us, I talk about the United States, it was scores of countries that were unbelievable in helping the Haitians after the earthquake. A second lesson that I know, I'm sure others at the panel will agree with me, but that is a public uninformed, infantilized, or even felt lied to will often disengage. We certainly learned that in the oil spill. There's litigation about the flow rate. This is the number, so I'm not going to, that came out, so I'm not going to talk about the specifics of it, but certainly the government's representation and BP's representation of the flow rate, whatever the number was, made people lack confidence in us and therefore lack confidence in the response. I think we hopefully were able to regroup from that. But what we have to learn often in Homeland Security and to repeat and to maybe relearn sometimes, because sometimes we forget, is the public is much more civic-minded than we give them credit for. This was particularly true in our work with H1N1. Jordan Grossman, in our first days at the Department of Homeland Security, I think we were at the same briefing, Jordan's a 1L here now, where this thing called H1N1, which no one knew what it was, began to threaten us. The truth is that the immediate desire by both the department and then Richard Besser, who was at CDC, was that we had to be honest about what we didn't know about what was going to be coming and whether and how much it would harm us. And I think that honesty about what we expected of the American public, while you always hear the stories of the people who don't get vaccinated, and some of them, and you hear them today, I will say that, they're actually the vaccination around particular threats and public health threats was phenomenal in the wake of, I think, our tremendous honesty about what we knew and didn't know. Third, ratcheting down is almost as hard as ratcheting up, as Phil Hyman and I wrote about a long time ago. So figure it out first, how you're going to ratchet up and then how you're going to ratchet down. because, and that may be for legal purposes, establishing sunset clauses, timeframes, oversight, whatever it is, because once you ratchet up, it is really, really hard to ratchet down. I recently wrote about a very small issue when I was in Massachusetts, not small for Massachusetts, but when you think of the big issues out there, but the National Guard, almost 6 years after September 11th, was still monitoring outside our only nuclear facility. At Pilgrim, when Deval Patrick's team, which I was the Homeland Security Advisor, came on board, we inherited this program that no one sort of had the, I don't want to say guts, that's the wrong word, there was such a psychological and political investment in keeping the National Guard there because they had been there. No one had thought, if we put them there September 12th, what are going to be the conditions in which we can say they're no longer necessary, not because there's no threat, but because there were actually essentially better means to defend a nuclear facility than 19 volunteers outside a wooden gate, which is essentially what the Pilgrim facility looks like. And so it took us a lot of time, and it was actually a wake-up call that when you put security measures in place, how you ought to think from the beginning, what are the conditions for ratcheting down? Because we will not always be in the situation. We suffered the same thing on the oil spill when the team with Thad Allen, I was his director of interagency for the spill, we did not set a perfect time frame for when we were gonna say this spill of national significance is over. There were obvious time frames. We capped the well 3 months after the capping the well. You could think of all these obvious time frames, but leaving and ending the sort of big response that we had and would have suggested to people in the Gulf, as they certainly felt at times, that the federal government was abandoning them and that we didn't care about the long-term restoration of the Gulf. And so we eventually got a good ratchet down, and we all got out of there, so to speak. But it is something to think about from the front end as for both legal and practical matters. And then finally, Lisa talked about international cooperation. I can't say it enough. Sometimes the problems are not our own and the solutions are not our own, and whether it's bilateral or international, we, the United States, whether it's bugs or drugs or thugs or plugs, whatever it's going to be, is that we're essentially not in control. And so one of the things that we've learned in the war on terror, the effort against terrorism, and certainly learned in Homeland Security, is how essential these coalitions are for not just the safety of individuals, but the safety of the environment and people all through, our neighbors and whoever else. So I'll leave with how these two examples for sort of how important it is that we get particular international legal regimes right, whether it's piracy, whether it's the Geneva Conventions, or whether it's the Treaty of the Seas or Land of the Seas. Next year, a Spanish company named Repsol intends and has been granted licenses 16 miles offshore, 5,000 feet down offshore of Cuba to begin the exact same process as BP did and on the exact same MODU, which is the facility that broke up. We've learned a lot of lessons, but I'm not sure how great we've been about sharing those lessons, or we've been good about sharing them, how great it's been people listening to those lessons. And we simply don't have a way to monitor what, in fact, Cuba has agreed to with this private Spanish company. All we know is the trajectory of any spill is now on the east side of Florida. There's just no doubt about it. So part of this is just sort of trying to continue to work with our international communities. The same is true, I'm trying to avoid terrorism, so I'm talking about the environment a lot, but the same is true in terms of the issues surrounding, what do I want to say, global warming. I'm allowed to say that because I believe it, but the issues around global warming, both in the Arctic and elsewhere. This is the first year in U.S. history in which 49 states have declared a natural disaster or a major declaration under FEMA rules. Before the end of the year. 49 of the 50 states have suffered something of the magnitude of which they will get a major disaster declaration from FEMA. So whatever you want to call it, it's something. And we have tremendous changes in the way the environment will change our security and our interests and the protection of our people This is particularly true, for example, in the Arctic, where now we have, this is going to be the first year in which we have the furthest ice retreat in history, so that the Arctic will be open almost all year long for commercial activity, with oil rigs that are coming in that are not required under international law to be double-hulled. Many of you who lived through or remember Exxon Valdez, that was exactly the problem, was that you just had no fail-safe. So there are tremendous issues out there of which we simply can't control, and so the international cooperation that I think those who are intimately involved with the war on terror also recognize may be helpful for thinking about drugs and thugs and plugs and bugs and whatever else may come our way. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Bobby. Dean Minow, thank you for having us here today. Thank you for opening this remarkable space for this conference. Bobby, I think you would agree with me. I'm incredibly jealous that we didn't have this facility when we were here.
We want to come back.
Yeah, we do. And I have come back, by the way. I was a visiting lecturer of law last year. I will be again this year. It's an incredible honor for me to be able to say that, first of all, and to be back with you all here amidst these great experts and the experts we're going to hear tomorrow. Ben, Gabby, let me commend you on not only this conference and the folks you've assembled, but also what will come from the conference. What you've laid out, Ben and Gabby, I think is the start of something very important, a dialogue that will inform policymakers, academics, and others who are in this field. And it's a field, as we've heard, that is going to constantly evolve and will need the innovation of very smart people such as yourselves and the folks you assemble. So I want to thank everyone for being here, and thank you for the invitation. What I thought I'd do was talk about three lessons that I think are important for us to adapt and to think about when we're thinking about the war on terror as it translates to transnational organized crime, drugs, pirates, and other transnational threats. And then three adaptations we should be very hesitant, or at least should be cautious about drawing lessons from and adapting. And I think they fall into two different categories. I think at a macro level, you can look at three principal lessons that will not only pervade in the war on terror, but will continue to inform how we deal with these other transnational threats. So let me just briefly go through those. I think in the first instance, 9/11 and the war on terror was more than just a remarkably tragic event and a historic event, but it really was a moment in our history where we realized that transnational actors, non-state actors, individuals, could have major geopolitical impact. We had seen this in the past. We'd seen it with the anarchist movement. We'd seen it with others. But this was really the first moment in the modern era where we saw a small band of people out in the darkest corners of the world in Kandahar able to use the elements of modernity against the world's remaining superpower, hitting the symbols of its military and economic might right in the heart of the homeland. And so 9/11 in some ways was more than a lesson about what al-Qaeda was doing to us. They were at war with the United States. More than just the threat of terrorism, which was real and potentially cataclysmic. But it was more so a lesson that you had a new era in national security. In the 21st century, you now had to worry about every corner of the world, and you had to worry about the gray zones, and you had to worry about transnational networks, which on their face may seem to be annoyances or potential problems locally or regionally, but in the 21st century actually could present global geopolitical risk. And so I think that's a grand lesson of 9/11, a grand lesson of the war on terror that continues now to then implicate other transnational threats. Second, national security in many ways matured in an aggressive way post 9/11. And as Juliet mentioned, we've gone through adaptations, chapters in the war on terror, and I think we've learned quite a bit by necessity, by demand, as to how to actually go about prosecuting the war on terror. But I think what's important here is that there has been a maturation of the national security paradigm itself. And that is to say, what we apply in the war on terror, as well as in the transnational threat context, is an all-of-government approach. In the first instance, as we heard, you have an emphasis on intelligence fusion, the ability to not only pull from classic intelligence sources, but to use private and other methods to gather information to understand the threat picture. You have, importantly, other elements of national power that are used as part of our national defense and projection of power. I had the great fortune of being at the Treasury Department starting in August of 2001 I had shifted there from the Department of Justice to work on anti-money laundering and international enforcement issues, customs issues, Secret Service issues. That was 3 weeks before 9/11. 9/11 forced a fundamental shift in how Treasury viewed itself and how the rest of government viewed Treasury in the use of financial power, suasion, tools, regulations, enforcement as part of an attempt to affect terrorist financing and counterterrorism. That same paradigm is now being applied across the board: counterproliferation, isolation of rogue regime activity. Even this past summer, as Lisa indicated, the administration's approach to transnational organized crime, very much taking from that very same paradigm to isolate rogue transnational organized crime activity. That is an all-of-national security, all-of-government approach to these issues. You even see it in the military context, where the very notion of counterinsurgency, the coin doctrine, is really a field level, a battle-adapted concept to thinking about how you use not just military means, not just classic national security means, but economic power, psychological power, power of information to actually influence the environment we're operating in. And so that's a great lesson, and one that I think will continue to inform these other issues. Third, and one that has been mentioned now by a couple of the panelists, and I think an underreported and underappreciated dimension of the war on terror, was an adaptation of how we engaged in international cooperation. This was more than just more robust information sharing, which certainly happened. This was about establishing multiple platforms of cooperation across the world, with a recognition that the United States certainly couldn't on its own deal with these transnational threats alone, and needed not just partners on a bilateral basis, but needed multilateral platforms, and needed new means and new platforms to actually get after some of these problems, and ways as well to action those efforts. I will underscore that one of the major problems here, and Juliet mentioned this, and one of the issues is whether or not you have international norms that guide and describe and provide a framework for that kind of cooperation across the board. And that it remains a challenge, I think, in the context of the war on terror. In this context, I want to leave you with one example in this context where the war on terror was incredibly successful and actually is providing a framework for how we deal with these issues moving forward. If you look at the problem of terrorism and even piracy, by the way, in Southeast Asia right after 9/11, the concern was that Southeast Asia would be the next front in the war on terror. You go back and look at all the foreign affairs magazines, all the key articles. That was a grave concern, and for good reason. You had al-Qaeda networks operating there. You had Jemaah Islamiyah, Abu Sayyaf, questions of whether or not governments like the Philippines could control their territory, questions as to whether or not repression of Muslims, for example, in southern Thailand was going to emerge into a new brand of insurgency with this Islamic violent extremist bent to it. So there was real concerns about what was happening, not to mention real terrorist attacks in places like Jakarta and Bali. What happened was a very aggressive model of counterterrorism cooperation in the region, where the countries in the region banded together and decided to apply hard and soft elements of power in cooperation to affect the problem. In addition, you had a key ally of the United States, Australia, that had both the capacity and will to provide support. And so if you look at all of the advancements of the Indonesian legal system, and in particular the law enforcement efforts there, it's due in large part to not only Indonesian will and capacity, but also the Australian help that came with it. Backed by all that then was U.S. support financially, in terms of capacity. If you look at what happened in Mindanao in southern Philippines, where the U.S. Special Operations Forces worked very closely with the Filipinos, that's a model, I think, for how to control a territory and to deal with an emerging problem. And so in that example, you have a model for how cooperation emerged locally, regionally, and globally. And that is a lesson that I think continues to inform not just terrorism, but also these other transnational issues. Now let me move to the three lessons and adaptations I think we need to be very cautious about and need to think very long and hard about, and no doubt will be part of some of the projects that emerge from the conference. And this I take to be at the more micro level versus the three issues I just talked about. The first is the need, and frankly a very careful need, of examining how we think about the use of kinetic force, lethal force. It has become part of the counterterrorism campaign, both politically, legally, and in terms of tactics, to use lethal force with deadly accuracy as part of our campaign. But there are real questions as to how far that should go. How far that should go in the context of al-Qaeda and al-Qaeda-related groups. For those of you who saw the front page of the New York Times today, that precise debate is underway in this administration, and I will tell you was underway in the prior administration. How far do these tactics go? And importantly, when you think about transnational organized crime groups, and you look at the Mexican cartels, which have been described as a narco-insurgency on our border, and are using more lethal and grotesque methods of violence, there's a real question then as to how you combat that very threat, and questions as to whether or not kinetic force, lethal force, should be allowed, and under what circumstances. So I think that will be part of a debate that we need to be very cautious about, because it raises all of the human rights, civil liberties, and international legal norm issues that no doubt we're all aware of. Second, I think one of the advantages of the issues that we talk about when we talk about other transnational threats other than terror is the advantage that these threats have emerged largely in local and regional contexts that are well understood in the context of legal norms, well understood in terms of how authorities have generally dealt with them. Piracy, there have been difficulties, but at a minimum there have been norms applied to pirates. And there have been tools that have traditionally been used. When we looked at the threat after 9/11, I think one of the disadvantages you had in the war on terror was you had a very different threat, or at least one that looked and felt very different. It was a threat where we now had to confront the very notion of terror, where terror had still political purchase around the world, whereas piracy does not, drug activity does not. You had a religious undercurrent tied to this. Al-Qaeda, this group, this vanguard of this movement, was trying to co-opt one of the world's great religions. And so that creates complications and difficulties. It's a movement with global and geopolitical motivations, and so it gets put in national security terms ab initio. In some cases, there are state sponsors, and others not, but state sponsorship is involved, and it's part of a broader global narrative. And so in some ways, the global dimensions, the more complicated religious, geopolitical dimensions of the war on terror, don't necessarily have to infect these other threats that we view transnationally. Even if they take on the same hallmarks, they don't necessarily have to take on the same global dimensions. And in many ways, that then makes it easier to handle and to grapple with, because these become more local, regional issues that can be contended with by intelligence services, law enforcement services, and good governance. Finally, and I think this is a major challenge both in the context of how we view terrorism and transnational threats, is this notion of blending and fracturing. That is to say, you have a blending of many of these terrorist groups with the classic categories that we once used in the 1990s to define, for example, foreign terrorist organizations, falling quickly by the wayside given the fluidity with which these groups operate, the lack of identification that these individuals operate under, and frankly, the speed with which this is happening given the nature of technology. Add to that the fact that the terrorism threat is then blending with some of these very transnational threats. One of the concerns, for example, with the al-Shabaab movement is that they are taking some degree of a cut from the pirate economy that has emerged in Somalia, not to mention running their own tax system, their own port fee system, and one of the most innovative trade-based money laundering systems I've heard of, using charcoal in the import of sugar. And so there is a blending of these activities, and you've seen this in North Africa with the drug trade, al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb coalescing with West African drug trafficking networks, and South American networks. And so this definitional categorization, which has served us quite well in the past, especially when you're looking at well-understood hierarchical organizations, may not be applicable, and I would argue will not be applicable in the future, thereby creating legal complications, political complications, and frankly, complications of political discourse. A final thought. I think the converse can be true, especially as we view, as Lisa described, the counterterrorism threat evolving and the threat from al-Qaeda. I call it an al-Qaeda hydra shifting. There are lessons that we need to relearn from the world of transnational threat and crime that will be important as the threat fragments and regionalizes and localizes. The best example I have of this is what we started to do in 2006, 2007, which has gained quite a bit of momentum, which is the use of the Drug Enforcement Administration and their jurisdiction, their reach globally, their relationships, and their ability to go after drug trafficking networks to start to impact transnational threats of concern that were not just terrorists, but other threats that were of grave concern. So it was the DEA that went after Mansal al-Qassar, the Prince of Marbella, tied to Palestinian terrorist groups as well as other gun-running networks around the world. They arrested him. They're the ones who've gotten the top 3 or 4 of the Taliban narco-traffickers, lured them out and actually have them in custody in New York. They're the ones who, after 2 decades of manhunt around the world from intelligence services around the world, caught within 10 months the merchant of death, Victor Bout, who is set to go on trial in October in New York. And so I think the converse of the question is true here, and one that will be important moving forward in counterterrorism, which is, can we relearn lessons from how we have treated some of these transnational threats in the past to inform how we deal with these terrorist threats as they morph and emerge in the future? Thank you.
Let's give a round of applause to these terrific panelists.